Thank you all so much for having us. I do want to first off acknowledge my colleague Amy Hateman, who is here as well. So we will both be here all 3 days. So if you have questions that come up and you want to talk about your individual situations, we would be happy to talk to you. And I do want to thank Peter for fitting us in. This came about kind of last minute, so we're super excited to be able to come and talk to you about the statutory and regulatory situation revolving eDNA. It worked, I got it right. So real quick, Amy and I work at NOAA Fisheries, so the species we cover in the Office of Protected Resources include those species under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, which include all cetaceans and pinnipeds except for walrus. And then under the Endangered Species Act, there are many marine mammals that are also listed as endangered, so they have additional protections. Pacific salmonids, sawfish, sea turtles in water, sturgeon, and black and white abalone species. So where does permitting fit in? So a lot of this might be repeat. I know there are a lot of NOAA folks in the audience. So NOAA is within the Department of Commerce. Within NOAA, we are in the NOAA Fisheries, National Marine Fisheries Service. And then from there, we're in the Office of Protected Resources. And then we have a Permits and Conservation Division, which is where Amy and I work. And within that division, there are two programs. One is directed take, and the other is incidental take. So Amy and I work in the directed take program, which is where you're going out and you're intentionally getting close to or touching marine mammals for scientific research purposes. The incidental take program is you're incidentally taking marine mammals. Your intent is not to interact with them at all. So real quick, we'll talk about federal jurisdictions. Under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, NOAA Fisheries has seals, sea lions, and all cetaceans. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service gets manatees, sea otters, polar bears, and walrus. So if you're dealing with marine mammals, you have to think about which one you're working with, and from there you'll know which agency to go to. Under the ESA, NOAA Fisheries has jurisdiction over most marine and anadromous species, including sea turtles in the water. So that one can be a little bit confusing because Fish and Wildlife has jurisdiction over sea turtles on land and terrestrial and freshwater species. So I didn't make the rules. But, you know, the bad news is you might have to deal with two agencies. The good news is that we do collaborate a lot, and hopefully, you know, it won't be a difficult process. So real quick, the types of permits that we issue in the Office of Protected Resources. We have Marine Mammal Protection Act and Endangered Species Scientific Research Permits. So these are permits for field work on living animals or laboratory work. It could be on living animals, but mostly it's their parts. The Marine Mammal Protection Act and Endangered Species Enhancement Permits. Those are for species or stocks survival or recovery. There is also a category of commercial and educational photography permits, which are just for marine mammals under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. And those are for projects like documentaries of marine mammals. So when you see documentaries like Planet Earth, if they were done in US waters, those were done under a photography permit. And then we also have an option for Marine Mammal Protection Act public display permits, which is for import and capture of live living marine mammals from the wild or from a foreign institution. So the big question you guys all want to know is, do I need a permit for my eDNA activities? So just real quick, protected species parts. Parts are specifically included in the definitions of marine mammal in the Marine Mammal Protection Act and Fish and Wildlife in the Endangered Species Act. NOAA Fisheries considers original isolated DNA and RNA, because folks are now using RNA from environmental material, to be parts that are regulated under the MMPA and ESA. So if you have a protected species part, you should know and document the legal origin of that part. So big question comes up, what about amplified or synthetic eDNA? And when I talk about eDNA, I'm also including eRNA at the same time. So amplified DNA and RNA, so for example, a PCR product is not considered a marine mammal part. Therefore, no NOAA fisheries permit or authorization is needed. So collecting samples, and in this sense, I mean the environmental material. So for example, water, ice, sand, or soil that may contain eDNA. So in general, for NOAA fishery species, you do not need a permit to collect this environmental material that may contain eDNA. However, a Marine Mammal Protection Act permit or ESA permit may be required if you may harass or pursue a protected species, such as marine mammals, fish, or sea turtles, to collect your environmental material sample in the United States or on the high seas. And just as a note, possession and subsequent transfer of the initial environmental material does not require a NOAA fisheries permit or authorization. So isolated eDNA and eRNA, if a permit was needed because of potential harassment or pursuit, possession and subsequent transfer may be included in the terms of the MMPA or ESA permit that you were issued. If a permit is not needed, you're not going to be harassing, you're not going to be pursuing animals. For marine mammals, we have NOAA fisheries regulations that allow possession and transfer. For fish and sea turtles, no authorization is needed for possession, analysis, or transfer within the United States. Export of eDNA and eRNA. So regardless of whether a permit is needed for the collection of the original environmental sample, an MMPA and/or ESA permit is needed to export the marine mammal or fish species DNA and RNA. And again, this is not PCR product. It's not amplified DNA. Export of sea turtle parts falls under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. If you want to import eDNA or eRNA, again, if a permit was needed for the collection of the environmental material, for example, you're on the high seas and you're going to be closely approaching an animal to get your sample, the import may be included under the terms of the MMPA and/or ESA permit. If a permit was not needed, again, for marine mammals, NOAA fisheries regulations address import. For fish, an MMPA or ESA permit is required for import. Again, this is the isolated DNA. It is not PCR. It is not synthetic DNA. And like export, import of sea turtle parts falls under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So what about the Fish and Wildlife Service? So you must contact the Fish and Wildlife Service regarding their MMPA species or their Endangered Species Act species. The U.S. Fish and Wildlife is responsible for any CITES permitting. So if you're importing or exporting, you may need a CITES permit depending on the species that you are importing or exporting. When you import, Fish and Wildlife has wildlife declarations that you have to submit. So you would need to talk to them about those. And again, they have designated ports of import or export that you would have to go through unless you get a designated port exemption. And you can talk to Fish and Wildlife about that. I've included the contact information that we have for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Division of Management Authority, and those are the folks that we work closely with on these issues. So after you've gone through all this, and if you've decided that you do need a permit because you're going to be closely approaching animals to get your samples, or you're in a situation where you need a permit for import or export, we do have an online application system, authorizations and permits for protected species. So the orange box is the pre-application guide, and that will walk you through what kind of permit you need. And then we do have the app's website on the slide for your information. And then the red box is where you can search for permits. So if you want to see what other researchers have done as far as permits, you can go to that search box and you can search for the species, the location, different items there if you want more information about different permits that have been issued. And then we encourage you to consult our permitting web pages. So if you are just doing parts research, we do have a particular application that is just for marine mammal and protected species parts that is more of a streamlined process. It doesn't have questions about what you're going to be doing with live animals, how big your tag is, or what kind of biopsy sampling you're doing. So if it's just parts, you can use these application instructions, which are simplified. It will talk about the permit type, how to apply. The application instructions can be downloaded. We have qualification forms and examples, and then a brief introduction on what kind of reports and how you can request modifications to your permit if needed. So the key points is activities that may require a permit is if you're approaching animals that may cause harm or cause harassment or be considered a pursuit. If you're going to be importing or exporting original DNA and RNA samples, you could consider partnering with existing researchers to get environmental samples. If you need to get close enough to an animal, you could use our app search page to look for researchers who are in a particular area and see if you can partner with them to get the samples that you need for your work. You could also consider collaborating and applying with others as a group. If you work closely with folks and you have a common interest, common objectives, goals, you could look to working together. Again, use our app's webpage to get information about how to apply for a permit, and please follow the application instructions. So the instructions have all the information that we need to make a determination on whether or not the permit should be issued, and we need you to follow those. Okay, that is it. That is our office phone number and my email and Amy's email if you have any questions. Again, we will be here all 3 days, so if you have questions, please come find us. We'd be happy to talk to you about your particular situation and whether or not you may or may not need a permit. Thank you so much.